So hi everybody, welcome to another episode of my ambient patch tutorials. Before we get started, I just wanted to say a big thank you for all the subscribers. I actually quadrupled my subscriber count with the last video, which was really great. I'm really loving seeing all the interest in ambient and how it works. It's been also great interacting with all of you in the comments, both here and on Reddit, and seeing that this is useful for everyone. So yeah, please keep commenting, please keep suggesting other things that I can do. I know I've got quite a backlog now of suggestions, but I will keep making videos for you guys as long as you keep supporting me. So thanks again. So let's get into this particular patch tutorial. In this one, we're going to be using this monstrosity of a module right here, Magneto. So the first thing we're going to want to talk about with this patch is the clock. It's quite important to a lot of aspects of this patch. We're sort of going to be using Magneto as the master clock in a way, mostly because of the fact that it has these really convenient clock divisor outputs here, clocks 1 through 4. Now, Magneto's tempo is set by default via a tap tempo here, which of course you can always tap in and that will work great. In this case though, I am going to send in an external clock to the clock in here in order to make sure that this can resume after we power off, because if you do power off, it will lose the tap tempo that you have set. So I'm going to use Pamela's new workout over here. It's a nice stable clock source, way more complex than we need for this actual patch, but it's what I have on hand. So the Pamela's new workout is set to basically send out 100 pulses per minute. So we're going to patch that into our clock in. From there, we're actually going to use one of the clock divisor outputs here, the clock 2 out, and we're going to use that to clock marbles. Marbles in this patch is going to be our CV and gate generator. So I'll just patch that through. So now let's talk about marbles. I will be going more into depth on marbles in a later video, most likely, but I wanted to give you a little bit more of a description than I did in the last module, or in the last tutorial, I should say, about how I like to set things up. So I like to have marbles set up this way with green on both sides. I like to have the spread pretty high on the X side, bias a little off, steps somewhere in the quantized range, and a +2 octave spread. But I think the most important thing in this really is locking and using deja vu. So I have it set up on an 8-step pattern that's locked with a little bit of deja vu, meaning that we're going to get 8 steps that are generally going to be repeating themselves in terms of the CV values that are output on these 3 CVs here. However, every once in a while, because of the deja vu control, we're going to have a new note injected in, and the pattern will change and shift ever so slightly. This is really great for keeping a sort of sense of consistency while also not making things boring. The other thing that I really love to do with marbles is utilize this Y output. This is a continuously smooth voltage, basically. It's constantly changing, there's no stepping. It's really great for self-patching. So what I like to do is take it and patch it into the bias. What this is going to do for us is basically influence the center point of the random CV values that are decided upon. The spread determines how wide a value we have, so we have quite a high spread, so we're going to be getting highs and lows all clustered around the center point, which is the bias. So by using the Y control here to shift the bias, we're generating very, very different patterns. And you have to keep in mind that this is only taken into account when deja vu decides that it needs to pick a new value. So generally you're going to get the same sequence, but the new value that's picked may be spread or centered around an entirely different midpoint. So add some more differentials to what we're doing here. So now we got clock from Magneto, and we've got marbles set up as our CV and gates. Now we should actually make some sounds probably. So we're going to use rings for this. Now you could really use, any module that you want to do this particular thing, but I find that for this particular patch, things that make more percussive sort of string sounds work really well. So rings, obviously, things like plats up here, or you could use IntelliGel Plonk or the 2HP Pluck, those sorts of things. Now this is a little bit different of a setup than you probably saw in my last video. I'm still on 4-voice polyphonic, but I'm in orange mode here, and I've got the structure turned over to this side instead. We'll plug this in and you can see what it sounds like. Brightness dampening position, basically the same as I've had in my other videos. I'm not really going to make any major changes to that. So let's patch this up. We're going to take our strum value, or a strum rather, out of the gate T3 here. So from Marble's perspective, because we're in green mode here, we've got T1, T2, and T3. T2 is going to trigger every time the clock triggers. T3 and T1 are basically a branching, or like a Bernoulli gate, which means that you're going to end up with some percentage chance it'll be on T1, some percentage chance the gate will be on T3, and that's influenced by this bias. We've turned it up just a little bit, so we're just a bit more likely to get gates on T3 rather than T1, and you'll see why later on. Then we're going to patch our volt per octave in from X3, which is the corresponding CV output from T3. So let's patch this up and see what it sounds like. Get the clock going. So yeah, it's fine. Sounds nice. Nothing special, obviously, but that's typically how these patches start, right? The other thing that's really important for this particular patch is you actually don't want to output this the odd directly out to a mixer or directly into the Magneto or anything like that. You really want to run it through an attenuator up here. So let me just patch that up real quick. By running this through an attenuator, what it allows us to do is to fade the volume from rings prior to it entering the delay on Magneto here. So that way we can actually have Magneto's repeats sort of trail off. It's much less abrupt and it sounds much more ambient. So this is a very good idea. Now I can control this via this knob here, which we'll see a little bit later on. So now let's get into the real meat of this, which is the setup that we're going to use with Magneto. The very first thing that I would suggest is that you make absolutely sure that you have your firmware up to date on your Magneto. When I first got this module, I did not realize that there was a USB outlet on the back of it for really easy firmware upgrades. So it causes some major problems with this patch, especially if you're running 1.0.0. There's actually big problems with the speed dial here. So yes, make sure your firmware is up to date. Now, we're going to be running this in Echo mode, the default green mode that we start in. We've already got our clock patched up, so that's great. Let me just patch this out so we can hear what we're getting so far, which is going to be very little. Our left and right's out. We're going to turn up our dry a little bit here, just so we can hear. Turn up the attenuator, of course. Okay, so really not much to it right now, right? We haven't actually turned on any of the echo parts of this. So the first thing that I really like to do with Magneto is to set the record level. You can see this light here. It sort of indicates when you're starting to clip. So if I turn this up too high, see, now it turns red. You can see we're starting to clip. So adjust as you see fit here to make sure that you're not clipping, first off. The dry and wet levels, I like to have generally 25-75 for this particular one. So 25% dry, 75% on the wet side of things. So now let's turn on some of the feedback tape heads here. We're going to be running in triplet mode on the heads, and we're going to be running left, right in terms of our panning. So let's turn some of these up. Already starting to sound better, right? So head 1, maybe 25%, I don't know, something like that. Head 2, a little bit more. Heads 3 and 4, like, I don't know, 60-75%, something like that. You can adjust these to your liking. I would advise that you don't mess with 1 and 2 too much, because we will be using the shift head functionality, and when we turn this on, you'll see heads 1 and 2 actually add a very interesting effect, but if it's too loud, it really overpowers everything, so I like to keep them pretty far down. Now let's look at some of the other knobs that we can do here. Really important ones would be these tape age and so forth across here. So let me just turn tape age all the way down so that maybe you can hear a little bit better what's going on. Let me turn this up too. Okay, so if we turn tape age up, we're going to end up just making the sound warmer. So I like, in this case, to keep tape age cranked all the way up. Crinkle and wow and flutter are a lot less subtle, I should say. Watch what happens when I turn up wow and flutter. You can see it gives that sort of woozy, warbly effect that's really great. Don't want to turn it up too high. I like to leave it around 50%. Crinkle's even more dramatic. It really gives you the sense of broken tape, so listen to this. Yeah, it gets a little wild when it's up really high. I like to turn it down somewhere around here. Gives a little bit more movement to the sound without really just sort of distorting everything. We're gonna leave spring alone for now. You'll see why a little bit later. Now we're gonna actually also turn on the feedback functionality for heads 3 and 4, because you might have noticed already that, especially due to the fact that not every single gate that we generate is actually going in to rings and generating a new note, we sort of get some fading in between them, and we want this to be a little more consistent. So if we turn on the feedback with our repeats at 50%, notice we get a far less fading of the sound and much more of a sort of ambient pad background to everything. It's quite nice. Now, let's look at some of these other clock things that we can do here. The very first thing we're going to do is also to help with fading, and that is to send the clock 4 out into the infinite hold functionality here. So if I just switch this into transport mode so you can see what it's doing, it's like this. You can see that the character of the sound switches a little bit more. You can sort of hear some of the repeats a bit more, but you also get a far less fade out than you were as well. Now, let's talk about this shift head that we were going to use. It injects some really interesting pitch shifted repeats into everything. What we're going to do is trigger that from Marble's T1. Now remember that it's either T1 or T3 that trigger with each clock output here. So what we're going to do is kind of fill in the spaces where T3 isn't triggering by using T1 to trigger the shift gate. So let's do that. There we go. Interesting, right? And it adds to the sound a bit more. Now, this is why I was saying that you really. Now, this is why I was saying that you really want to be careful about using the locked T value over here. I would only lock X. If you lock T, I find that the shift head being turned on and off in any sort of really rhythmic fashion sort of sounds strange. I mean, experiment with it as you like, but I like it to be a lot more random and just filling in those gaps when Rings isn't playing. Now that we've got these shifts set up, another really important thing, and you'll actually find this mentioned in the manual from Magneto, is that you want to clock this play functionality on the transport. Honestly, I can't tell you exactly what it is that it does, but it's supposed to make the shifted repeats be more in time with the clock. And you can already hear that, like, they sound pretty close, but watch what happens when I patch it up. Just sounds a little bit more in time, I think. So this is personal preference. You can take it or leave it on that one, but give it a shot. let's deal with the spring reverb side of things. So, oh, you know what I just realized? I clocked this wrong. This is supposed to be clock 2. There we go. Now, let's do clock 3, which was what it was patched into previously. Clock 3 is what we're going to use to actually trigger the spring reverb. We're going to go from 0 to 100, 0 to 100 for the moment. It adds a bit of a rhythmical element, so just listen to what this sounds like. Nice, right? Now, maybe it's a bit too rhythmic for you or a bit too abrupt. It is for me. So one thing that I like to do is actually send this out to an envelope generator instead. So in this case, I would patch this out to stages over here. We just have stages set up as a very simple envelope generator. You can see what's happening when I trigger it. Basically, we're having an attack, brief sustain, and a release, very, very brief release phase. So if I then patch this up to the spring, we get an effect like this. Still a good sort of semi-rhythmic thing, but not quite as abrupt as it was before, which I really like. Now, the last thing I want to talk about in this patch is the speed and pitch knob here. It has an interesting effect on echoes in that it affects the fidelity of the echoes. So, for a moment, I'm just going to turn the dry signal down so we're only hearing wet now. Now, listen to what happens when I turn the speed dial all the way to the left. Notice it's got a major lo-fi sound to it right now. It's quite nice. I can also turn it all the way to the right. Now it's kind of a sparkling, clean, very, very digital sounding echo. So adjust this as you like. In my case, I really like having it all the way to the left, like this, to get that nice lo-fi sound to it. Now, speaking of lo-fi, I did have a request for a little bit more with the lo-fi junkie. I may do something in more detail with it, but I wanted to add in a little bit of it here, just so you can hear what it sounds like, because it works really, really well with this very lo-fi, all the way to the left version of the speed and pitch knob here. So right now, if you listen, you might notice that the repeats sort of sound a little bit out of place with the dry signal. The dry signal is very bright and hi-fi, I guess, and the repeat signal is very lo-fi. So what we can do to actually fix that is split the signal here. So after our attenuator here, let's split this. Let's go and take the signal and send it into the lo-fi junkie and just direct out to mixer. And then we'll also send the signal into Magneto as usual. In this case, we're going to turn the dry all the way down on Magneto. So right now we're just hearing the wet signal. What we can do is turn on the signal from the lo-fi junkie. So that's with the lo-fi junkie. Now let's go back to the original sound. So quite bright, back to the lo-fi junkie. Sort of matches a bit better, right? Both signals are more lo-fi. It's a really great combination that I suggest you try. And then of course, when you're done with this patch, because you've got this attenuator here, you can do a really nice fade like this. Great. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll be back with another episode in a few weeks.